Distinguished colleagues, friends,
начинаем
we're
пленарную
launching
сессию
our plenary
очередного
session of
Гайдарского форума
the
«Россия
2018 Gaidar
и мир».
Forum, Russia in the
В этот
World.
раз мы решили назвать его
This
«Цели и
time, the
ценности».
slogan is Values and Virtues,
Но начать я хочу
which is the
с
title. But let me
зачитания
begin
приветствия. Мы получили
by
приветствие от
reading
президента
the
Российской
greetings from
Федерации
the
Владимира Владимировича
President of
Путина,
Russia, Vladimir
участникам и
Putin,
гостям
to the
9-го
guests and participants
Гайдаровского
of the
форума.
9th Gaidar
Уважаемые
Forum.
друзья, приветствую вас в
Dear
Москве
friends, I
на
welcome
9-м
you to
Гайдаровском
Moscow at the
форуме.
9th
Ваши
Gaidar
встречи по
Forum.
традиции
Your
собирают
meeting as a
авторитетные
tradition
представительные
gets together
аудиторию
and
для
brings
обсуждения
together
актуальных вопросов
high-profile panel of
социально-экономической
experts to
повестки
discuss
России и тех
socioeconomic
тенденций, которые
development of
определяют
Russia and the
развитие всего
trends
мира.
that will
Мы
decide the
видим, что
development of the
сегодня
world.
все
As
более
we
важным
see
решающим фактором
today, an
лидерства, конкурентоспособности и
ever-growing
успеха
importance
компаний и
for the
государств становится знание и
competitiveness of companies
компетенция.
and nations
Способность
is
генерировать и
knowledge as
быстро
well as
осваивать прорывные
competences.
технологии,
The ability to
создавать
generate
максимально
and
широкие
tap into
возможности для
disruptive
реализации
technologies and
таланта,
provide a
потенциала каждого
broad
человека.
context
И не
to implement
случайно,
the
что в центре
talents and unlock
внимания
potential of
нынешнего
each and every
форума такие темы,
individual
как
is
образование и
important. Today,
подготовка кадров,
education
цифровизация всех
and
сфер жизни, внедрение
professional
государственных
training,
услуг и
digitalization,
сервисов,
and
удобных,
public
комфортных для
services
всех людей
that
и
will be
бизнеса.
convenient for business
Рассчитываю, что по
community and
всем этим
individuals
направлениям
is on the
пройдут
agenda of your
содержательные
forum. I hope
дискуссии,
that you
в
will
ходе
debate on
которых
all the
родятся новые
points
оригинальные
of this
идеи,
agenda and give
нестандартные
rise to
инициативы,
new,
востребованные
novel
на практике.
ideas
Желаю
and
вам
new
плодотворной и
concepts and
конструктивной
practical
работы.
recommendations. I wish you fruitful work. Thank you.
Разрешите
President
поблагодарить
Vladimir
президента
Putin.
за это
Let me thank
теплое
President
приветствие.
Putin for his warm words of greeting.
Начинаем нашу пленарную сессию.
And we start our plenary session. We've got the live broadcast on Russia 24 TV channel. And as a custom, this forum paves the way for the socioeconomic discussions of the year. Therefore, I'd like us to begin by assessing the point where we currently are located and the prospects for the upcoming several years, which will be the topic of this plenary session and the forthcoming 3 days of our discussions. As I believe, the overall landscape is quite interesting because probably virtually everywhere we're out of the crisis woods, and being an economist and historian, I may say that this time the anti-crisis agenda of all the countries was quite successful compared to the policies taken in the past crisis, and we're approaching the trajectory of sustainable growth. And let's discuss today the problems and the issues of the socioeconomic development of the 3 to 5 years to come, and most importantly, let's go beyond the economic issues and economic agenda. I would, if I may say, economics or something beyond economics, something more important than economics. Let's analyze factors outside the economy and economics that will help shape the socioeconomic development of the forthcoming years. On the panel, we have distinguished colleagues. I believe ours will be a unique discussion today. Out of 5 international panelists, 3 are fluent Russian speakers. I'm not sure whether they will intervene in Russian or in English, but 3 of them speak the Russian language. We have Kristalina Georgieva, CEO of the World Bank, that used to be Vice President of the European Commission and used to be the permanent representative of World Bank to Russia and the resident representative. Then Mykkänen, a Finnish politician, Minister of External Trade and Development of Finland with a profound business track record. Herman van Rompuy, President of the European Politics Center, who used to be the first European Council President. And prior to that, he served as the Belgian Prime Minister. He has a unique political track record and expertise. Frenkel, CEO of JP Morgan Chase International, who used to be governor of the Bank of Israel, and he has tackled the goal of making Israel out of a country with hyperinflation, a country with quite a stable currency and low inflation. And Ivan Krastev, a brilliant political analyst and columnist of New York Times, head of Liberal Strategy Center in Bulgaria and Humanities Institute in Austria. And all of them are very prominent people with lots of positions that they serve in. Now I'd like to ask one general question to kickstart the discussion, and afterwards we would go specific, and I will make some clarifications and additional questions as we proceed. So how would you, everybody, characterize today's state of the global economy and politics? In particular, what are the key challenges and the key risks of the upcoming 3 to 5 years? Just in a nutshell, 2 to 3 challenges or risks briefly. Let us start from you, Jacob, and go in line afterwards.
Thank you very much. Since I am the first to speak, I want to thank you very much for the kind invitation, and it's a privilege to be here today. You know, it is said that the economic science is the dismal science. One only sees clouds, one only sees dooms, and all the rest. A very pessimistic science. Well, let me start today by saying, if that's the case, then probably I'm not an economist. Because I believe that the state of the world economy today is much better than what it was in any of the preceding 10 years. This is the first year in which each and every region of the world is growing positively, and in which all the revisions of forecasts have been for the upside. This is the year in which there are some challenges, but at least there is a debate and there is a recognition that there is a lot to lose if one allows some of the negative directions to take hold. And we will discuss some of these negative directions. But let me just say that when you look today at forecasts of the world economy, in this year, the expectations by the IMF and many other organizations is that the world as a whole will grow at about 3.8%, that there will be the usual division between emerging markets and industrial countries. Emerging markets will continue to grow at a rate double the one from the industrial countries, and emerging markets will continue to be led by a faster growth by India, China, and the like. So those are issues that we are familiar with. But when we look in the past few years, and we say that unemployment was one of the major challenges for the industrial countries, unemployment has declined in the United States to the lowest level since many, many years, 4.1%. Europe, that some years ago, not many years ago, people said Europe is a sleeping continent that will never wake up. Europe's recovery is in place, and growth in Europe is also much faster than what was predicted. So in other words, I think that the picture is much more positive, yet it highlights some of the challenges. And when we spoke about unemployment, youth unemployment is still a major challenge in many of the countries. The solution to youth unemployment is a long-term structural issue that has to do with education, with increasing the flexibility of the economic system, and the like. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, just by saying that when we speak about the world economy, we need to secure that the economy remains being a world economy. There is no greater challenge to economic recovery than fragmentation. Globalization should be viewed as an opportunity, a reality, rather than a threat. And therefore, as we hear the calls for protectionism, for raising walls, for intervening with trade, for fragmentation, that's a concern, and the recovery will not be diffused internationally unless we ensure the openness of markets. There is one intrinsic issue, which is economic policy makers, especially if they run for elections, are very much focused on the short term. It is essential that we provide the long-term perspective by embodying institutions that have the luxury of looking into the long term, like the World Bank, like the IMF, like central banks, like international organizations. They must be empowered to protect us from ourselves and from the temptations to look in the short run. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое. Kristalina,
Thank you so much, Kristalina. I will just keep asking questions and providing clarifications. Following up on what has been said, and from the perspective of the World Bank and your economic expertise, what can you say? The world today, I believe, has a conflict and a collision between short-term and long-term growth factors. Everything that will give growth in the upcoming 1 or 2 years wouldn't matter much in the long run, and may be dangerous, as we can judge from the Soviet experience of the 1980s. And all those things related, important in the long run, like human capital, education and others, will not give immediate results or after effects. Do you see any risks here? Because the World Bank is a long-term driven entity and institution. How can you struggle with this risk? And what is to be done about the human capital? Some believe it is very important. All of us believe it's important, but it will not provide immediate growth. Thank you so much. Good day. I'm so glad to be here. All the Bulgarians think that they can speak the Russian language. And I will try to prove that it is so. I'll start speaking Russian and then I will switch into English. Well, first, here in Russia we have a very good saying, don't count chickens before they're hatched. Like if we look at the past several years, the chickens are okay, and it's autumn, it's high time they were hatched, and we count the chickens. But what about future? The future is more difficult, and I'll switch into English, therefore, and hence.
What we see in the demands that are coming to the World Bank from virtually all economies, emerging market economies in the upper end of the spectrum or poor countries, is one and the same question. What are going to be the new drivers of growth? We all see that some of the traditional drivers are there, like investment in infrastructure, like improving the business environment. We have to continue with those. But in this world of disruptive technologies, how do we adapt to it? What is it that we do? And the conclusion we have made is that investment in people is going to dominate these new drivers of growth. We have just completed a report that is going to be published in the next weeks on the wealth of nations. And what we try to do in this report is to calculate what is the space of human capital within the wealth of nations. If you take physical capital, institutions, human capital, what is its share?
Kristalina, можно спрошу? Я правильно понимаю, что это перефразированное
it's like paraphrased title of Adam Smith's book.
И вопрос о том, как посчитать.
Precisely. And the question is how we count that. And we calculated, and it turns out that 65% of all capital and wealth, 65% of the wealth of nations falls on the human capital. Human capital accounts for 65% of that. And today, and in future, it is very important.
The question is how we take that investment in human capital forward. We just started what we call Human Capital Project that is concentrated on determining more precisely the components that form human capital: education from early years through lifetime, health, and the systems of social protection. And here are some early observations. In terms of education, we have to move much more aggressively in calculating learning versus years spent in school, and come with an adjustment of these years spent in school on the basis of how actually it has contributed to learning. Second, take work. Work we have not measured as education or learning, but work is actually hugely important for the quality of human capital. The same way going to a bad school or having bad teachers, going to a bad job can have longer-term negative impact on the quality of capital. And here for Russia, and this is something Russia is looking very seriously into, and for all economies, the question of informality of work being in this more dynamic but less structured working arrangement. What do we do with it? How we make sure that if we have 20% in the informal economy, this doesn't mean that the quality of human capital could be impacted negatively. And then, of course, finally, we look at social protection. Traditionally, and I will stop here, traditionally we say social protection works when it is like a safety net. So something bad happens to you, you fall in the net, it holds you. But now we are saying, well, that's good, not good enough. We have to have a combination of a net and ropes. So we actually have a social protection system that helps people climb up rather than being dependent on that net concept. So a lot to be thought through, and we would be very, very interested to do as much as possible the analysis on a country level, so it is informed by actual developments, and then we can learn from each other. Can I say one more thing that is not about human capital? In terms of what we worry about looking into the next 5 years, we do worry about, in some places of the world, that sustainability becoming again a problem. Why we worry? Over this last years of very low interest rates, there has been appetite to borrow, and in some parts of the world, this appetite has gone a bit too far. Instability already starts popping up. And in the corporate sector, in the business sector, again, if we are to move to a different trend in the interest rates, the implications of this may be a bit too serious to swallow.
Спасибо большое. Продолжая
тему
вызовов и рисков,
continuing on
обращаясь к Hermanu
challenges
Van
and
Rompuy,
threats,
с
I'd like to
учетом
turn
его
to Mr.
колоссального
Van Rompuy,
европейского опыта,
bearing in mind
я
his
хочу
colossal
попросить
European
вот
expertise and
прокомментировать
track
тему вызовов и
record.
рисков,
Would you please
все-таки
comment on the
обратить
risks and
внимание на
focusing
перспективу
on the
ЕС.
prospects of the European community. I can't but not mention saying that Mr. Van Rompuy was the first European Council President, and under your leadership, Europe went through a very difficult downturn, and as we can see, as Jacob Frenkel said, Europe is today emerging out of the woods. And how do you assess Europe's future and prospects? And this two-way model, two-pattern model, the Eurozone and the rest of the Europe. This compound model. What are the risks that you see from the perspective of the EU and its future?
Thank you, Mr. President. First, a few thoughts, a few considerations on your first question about the future. I'm getting an older man, although I have not the looks. I try to convince myself that it's not the case. But I still remember that 50 years ago, there was a title in a French newspaper, Le Monde, the most famous French newspaper, France is boring. 2 months later, we had 10 million people in the streets. It was what we call the May '68 revolution. Then we had 20 years later, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the financial crisis, the Arab Spring, never expected, never predicted. Never, with all the analytical tools we have. So expect the unexpected. Answering your question, Professor, 5 years ago, in the beginning of 2012, most people said, no, the Eurozone will collapse for sure. The only problem is when? Before Christmas 2012 or after Christmas 2012? We celebrated Christmas 2017. So I'm very cautious as far as predictions and forecasts are concerned. If you had said in 2013 that today, in 2018, Europe will have had a growth of employment of 10 million people, nobody would have believed you. Nobody. So we overcame an existential crisis, the crisis on the Eurozone. We overcame some kind of also an existential crisis, the refugee crisis. I know that the problems are not over, but the existential crisis in both cases are over. So there are reasons to be much more hopeful. And I apologize when I say something positive, because not only the economics is a dismal science, it is now political correct to be very pessimistic. I'm not so pessimistic. Of course, we have to be very cautious, and that's always. Doing the good is one thing, avoiding the worst is also doing the good. Avoiding the worst, and Kristalina mentioned it already, is we have to gradually come out of this expensive monetary policy. And the way we are conducting this is crucial. Not only in Europe, also in the United States and also in China. How to avoid bubbles and the explosion of bubbles. Avoiding the worst is also how to avoid outright protectionism. There are a lot of protectionist measures taken in the last years. We are not still in the stage of outright protectionism. So avoiding the worst, explosion of bubbles, and protectionism is a big thing. For economic growth, the big issue for the upcoming years is how to raise productivity in Europe, in Russia, in the United States and other countries. I saw a figure last week that the productivity growth in one of the major European countries is the lowest since 1820. 1820. So this is a crucial problem. GDP is a very simple thing. It's the hours worked multiplied by productivity. If demography is going in the wrong direction, you have to put everything on productivity. And productivity means investment and means innovation. And so pushing innovation and investment, because that is the embodiment of innovation, will be crucial, especially in the European Union. That's why we took a lot of initiative for this. So productivity is the key issue. The second, of course, and you know this in Russia more than even we do in Western Europe, is demography. And not only the cost of demography, but demography as a driver for initiative and innovation. You know, your best years are before your 30s. Afterwards, you can be very active, but you are creative in your before and after your 30s. So, in demography means that we, in the upcoming future, in European Union, in large parts of it, also in your country, the burden of growth, the responsibility for growth will be put on the shoulders of a small younger generation. So the war on talents, raising skills, promoting equal opportunities for all, so mobilizing all the talents available in a society is of crucial importance. Because without that, we cannot sustain even our reformed social systems. A second or third point in my positive agenda is fairness. In the United States, wages are stagnating since decades. And this is at the root of populist tendencies. You can have growth, but you have to be very careful to distribute it more evenly than today. It's not only a problem for the industrialized world, it's also a problem, for instance, for China. My concern for the European Union is that we found the necessary strength, the necessary courage and leadership, because it's a question of leadership, to strengthen the Eurozone and to strengthen the Schengen zone. And for the Eurozone, deepening the banking union, deepening the economic union, and deepening the fiscal union. We know perfectly well what to do. The only thing is that we have to do it. All the reports are available. So just do it. How do we find the right balance between responsibility and solidarity? There we count much on the leadership of France and Germany for doing this. And the same with the Schengen zone. If we don't protect our external borders better, then we will have sooner or later again some kind of crisis. And that comes me to my last point, Professor, and I will be very brief on it. Of course, populism is there, and they are almost in no place in power, almost. But they are impacting the political agenda. Impacting the political agenda also on the socio-economic field. Because a populist don't want to be popular. It's as simple as that. He don't take risks to become unpopular. So structural reforms in the labor market, in the pension and so on, are made much more difficult. Because a populist is again not going against the tide, against the mood of the country. And it's impacting the political world also in another way, that is volatility. Populism creates fragmentation of the political landscape. All parties become medium-sized or small-sized, and they take no risks, or they have a tendency to take no risks for courageous long-term policies. So the impact of populism is not only on migration, on rhetoric, on the culture, the civilization. It's also impacting, or can also impacting policies. And that's for the European Union quite a challenge. So leadership is from utmost importance. Politics matter more than ever.
Спасибо большое, Kai Mykkänen.
Thank you very much, Kai Mykkänen. I've got a question to you. It is only natural, since you are Minister for External Trade and Development. I'd like to ask you about globalization. Jacob has firmly said that globalization is important, but as we know, globalization comes in waves. What is Finland expecting right now? Are there risks for the development of globalization, or on the contrary, for the wrap down and pullback of it? What's your view? Thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in this discussion.
I want to just mention that at the same time as we can and must be proud that we have now growth in global levels and also in Europe, we must also notice that especially in Europe, it's quite much affected by the dramatic, aggressive monetary easing, supporting huge amounts of cheap liquidity to European economy, and actually which during the first years of the anti-crisis methods did surprisingly little effect for real economy, and now is slowly also affecting to investment activity and so forth, but it might have certain risks for the long-term perspectives as well. Well then, and first if Mr. Professor Mao asked about 3 global challenges, I would just shortly say that on my opinion it's definitely saving the free trade regime globally, and here I would echo very much what Mr. Jacob Frenkel said, and also Mr. Van Rompuy echoed here. Second, solving the issue of growing income differences in the Western world, which also is a precondition for saving political support for global trade, because now populistic movements actually take their strength from the fact that income differences are growing in those economies where traditionally income differences have been very small in comparison to, for example, to Russia or most fast-growing economies. And then actually, if you ask the third challenge, and this is just a note of rational insurance economists, that of course the third large challenge for us to tackle is the climate change. We would be doing a very stupid decision rationally if we take that large risk in comparison to the investment that would be needed to avoid that large risks that we are taking. But then about globalization especially, well, in Finland, globalization, free trade, they are positive words, and in Northern Europe overall. And the reason is that if you look to the story of Finland, we were one of the poorest nations in Europe 100 years ago when we gained our independence, and actually nobody here in Moscow or St. Petersburg, nor in Berlin or even Stockholm would have anticipated that now I would be sitting here as a representative of one of the most advanced economy where education system is one of the best, etc. And the fact that this has happened is very much a story of global trade. For us, as a small open economy, it would have been totally impossible to take that dramatic leap in 1 century without having trade open for most of the century, actually both to West and East. And in that sense, our governments have been quite wise and also had good luck in many occasions that has been possible. Then if you looked at what happened, for example, for Argentina, which actually was a positive surprise of the 19th century. During the 19th century, they did the same as Finland did now in the 20th century. Started from a poor South American economy and ended up actually more wealthier than Italy or France in the early years of the 20th century. But then what happened actually after the First World War, the trade links were pretty much closing for Argentina, and the economy started to suffer. And then they actually entered also politically more to nationalistic rhetorics and nationalistic populism because of the problems probably. And then that actually caused a situation where the second century of Argentina was very different in relative terms from that of the first. And that's of course something that we are thinking now in Finland when we are 100 years old as a nation, that what will happen for next century. And this is also the answer that for us, we are not only supporting global trade, globalization, and all the productivity possibilities that we see there, but actually it's pretty much, especially for us in Northern Europe, among small open economies, it's a crucial survival strategy that populism and protectionism won't prevail, and we manage to keep the pace of freeing up trade and making investment to global arena.
Спасибо большое. Иван
Thank you very much, Ivan Krastev.
Я хочу попросить,
I would like,
развивая эту тему, коснуться
as a follow-up to this question, I'd like to touch upon two questions from the humanitarian point of view, sort of. For some reason, little has been said by the previous speakers about digitalization, whereas digitalization is a very important trend. It is both a risk and a potential, a new opportunity, just as everything else. What about digitalization? Is it a risk to the democracy, or is it a new opportunity for the democracy? On the one hand, as we can see, digital opens up colossal opportunities for populism. On the other hand, the digital technologies open up opportunities for sorting out many questions without the intermediary of the government. So my question is, between populism and digitalization, where are the risks and where are the opportunities?
Kristalina basically filled the quota for the Russian-speaking Bulgarians, so I'm not going to torture you with the quality of my Russian. But secondly, my major argument is going to be is that the biggest challenge that we have is to get right the time in which we're living now. There is a short story of a Bulgarian writer called Blind Vaisha. And this is the story of a beautiful girl. Her right eye was seeing only the past, and her left eye was seeing only the future. So she cannot function. For example, she could not marry, because when a 30-year-old handsome man proposed to her, her right eye was seeing a 10-year-old kid, and the other eye was seeing a 60-year-old man. I'm saying this because even if you see what politicians and technology people are reading these days, you're going to see that we're very much in the blind eye situation. Politicians normally read history and political biographies, while Silicon Valley type, nevertheless where they are, these days they're basically reading science fiction. And this type of a groups has a problem to talk to each other. And this is also the story of digitalization. 10 years ago, social media were called liberation technologies. If you go 5-6 years ago, you're going to see that the revolutions of the world did not have ideological names anymore. They have a company names. In 20th century, when somebody goes on the street, you're going to say it's the communist or fascist and so on. This is the names. Now this is a Twitter revolution, Facebook revolutions, company names. I'm saying this because this is the problem. The best and the worst is the same. The same technologies that allow people to participate most are also creating a problem for controlling people. The big data, for example, is one of the ways for authoritarian governments to have a better information on the state of their society without using basically the police institutions that are distorting information. So in my view, this is why trying to understand the nature of a time which is really transitional, but not in a political sense. For example, with people living longer, imagine that we are going to, in the next 10, 20 years, really have a major prolonging of human life. Just 3 questions to ask you. How this is changing not simply the situation on the labor market, but how this is changing the relations between different generations. For example, in Eastern Europe, where you have a very particularly demographic situation, not very different than Russia, one of the interesting stories is that you have, if there is a dictatorship, this is the dictatorship of the older voters. So for the younger people, it's much more the exit than the voice. For example, if you have a kind of a longer living people, what is going to be the age on which political leaders will decide to retire? I'm asking all these questions because I do believe we're in a time in which it's not so important what kind of answers we're going to ask. The problem is what kind of questions we're going to discuss. And this is why this history versus science fiction story, this blind Weisha story, I find particularly kind of a risky, because some people tend to believe that we're simply repeating something that was before, and here we come to populism story. Listen, populism is one of the words that is most misused. I do believe that probably it should be banned if we want to have a normal conversation, because these days, particularly in Europe, populist is everybody whom you don't like. By the way, the Oxford Dictionary have always defined the word of the year. This is the word in which the searches for the meaning of this word has basically increased most during the year. In 2017, the word defined by Oxford Dictionary was populism. In 2015, it was austerity. In 2016, it was paranoia. So from austerity through paranoia to populism. I'm saying this because there are three things about populism that I find important. First, this generation of populist parties and leaders are not necessarily economic populists. It's not a classical pro-inflation parties. They're much more cultural parties. It's much more identities. It is much more the politics of a threatened majority groups. Majorities who are majority today, but they are not sure that they're going to be majorities tomorrow. The second thing about these populists are that they are not about the future. They're much more trying to stop time. So from this point of view, this is conservatism in a time of a permanent revolution is reactionary by definition. And the third thing about populism is that you're going to be surprised, but in a certain way, you have a lot of populist parties getting into a government and not much is changing in the policies. So the decoupling between the politics and the economy is something that I see as the most important. And just to end with how this is going to affect how democracy functions. Listen, digitalization created a different type of utopia. I still remember an old Romanian, this type of science fiction story, telling the history of the story of a regime in which when the president is elected, a bomb device is put into his body. And everybody with their smartphones, anytime the president takes a decision, votes yes or no. If 3 times the president gets the wrong decision, he explodes. Are you going to call it democracy? I'll be surprised if this is a democracy, but this is how many people basically believe it, and this is why proliferation of the referendums and demands of the referendums is becoming one of the major trends that we see not only in Europe, but I do believe globally. Because people tend to believe that when the sovereign speaks, in his vocabulary there are only 2 words, yes and no.
Thank you very much. Kristalina wants to make a short remark.
Just to share something with the audience that I found very, very interesting when we talk about digitalization and how the world is changing. I was with the Minister of Singapore when Singapore got the announcement they are #1 in PISA rating. So what do? I go to him and say, congratulations, you must be very happy. He looks at me and says, happy about what? To be #1 of a rating of the 20th century makes me not that happy. The question is, how do we measure in this new world our ability to adapt? And he turned to me and said, this is what needs to be now measured. How learning makes you more adaptable to disruptive change. And I think for all of us, this has to be an obsession, because unless we underpin this adaptability, not only in terms of political impact, but in terms of our economies, we would have a huge problem. My aha moment came when I got my Tesla. Tesla, very cool car. How many of you have driven Tesla? Okay, still a minority. It's a great car. It has a self-driving capability. So I put it on self-drive, car took over, came to a curve. I know the car can take the curve, but I don't trust it. So I took over. And then I realized I'm not yet adapted. And adaptability is the biggest challenge we all face and will continue to face. So best of luck to all of us in this new world of rapid change.
Thank you very much. You know, I think it was quite justified to talk about populism. What is populism? Is it more of a democracy of a demagogic speeches? And I'd like to address Jacob Frenkel. I'm going to ask him a non-economic question. I could ask him about the future of the monetary policy, of unconventional policies, but my question is going to be altogether different. I think it is one of the key questions right now. Have we entered the world of post-truth or not? We have discussed those risks. Kristalina has mentioned. How do we measure them? Do we measure the truth? Can we do that? Can we say that what we're discussing has any sense in economic terms and beyond economics? Jacob, what is your view, the view of an economic scientist on a political question, a non-economic question?
Thank you. I would have loved to discuss a future monetary policy, but I will go to your direction.
And a couple of minutes, not more.
A couple of minutes. When you speak about post-truth, are we in a post-truth era? I don't know a single person that will say, I am practicing a post-truth strategy. Because I believe that my way is the truth. So when we speak about post-truth, I assume you mean lack of consensus of what is the truth. You have yours, I have mine. Question, what brought it about? For many generations, there was scholarship, the attempt to find the truth, the criteria of what truth is, and also the norm that that's what you want to find and to follow. And suddenly so many discussions, including your question, mean post-truth. What is it? There are many reasons, and let me mention two. The first one is natural consequences of social media. And it's not a normative statement. I think it's a description of the reality. Think about groups in the social media. You have WhatsApp, you have WeChat, we have various groupings in the social media. In that group, I know that I need now to shorten speaking about alternative truth. So when you...
I'm sorry, let me cut you short. It is my honor to tell you that the chairman of the Russian government, Dmitry Medvedev, is going to join us in a second. Mr. Medvedev, we have left the economic field and transferred to the humanitarian field. So, Jacob, could you finish, please, what you started?
Yes, I will finish without starting and will be extremely efficient just to convey the point. When any of you joins a social media group, WhatsApp, you name it, you normally create the group by people who are similar to you, who share your views. You communicate with them on an ongoing basis. And therefore, as you communicate with your likes, you are basically looking in the mirror and find a group that thinks like you, and you define it as the truth because that's the only thing that you are exposed to. At the very same time, another group is creating their truth. They are not exposed to your truth because they do not belong to the same social media. And therefore, it's so difficult to predict election results, because when you do polling, you look at your own peers and you are so surprised that somehow another view exists, and vice versa. It is an environment that creates lack of tolerance to the other. It is an environment that emphasizes we versus them rather than us. It is an environment that suddenly creates different narratives. And I think that that's one of the challenges of the social media era, how to prevent the fragmentation that may arise from a very positive effort to increase interaction. When you superimpose this on a reality that has taken place in the last 5 years or even 10, that large portions of the populations feel that the governments do not serve them, feel that they were left behind, feel that those in the driver's seat, your cars or not, have misguided them. This means that they look for an outsider. It means that experts have lost their credibility. In the most complex world since the beginning of mankind, experts are traded in a discount. It's a very dangerous reality. And you impose it one on each other, and suddenly you have also an ideology of saying, if you belong to those who were drivers, you cannot drive again. We will take an inexperienced driver. Can you imagine going on a plane, and as you start taking off, the pilot says, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to my inaugural flight. I've never flown before. Let's do it all together. Normally, you would not like this to happen. So I think that the challenge now is to restore the trust in experts, restore the recognition that experts are needed, and which means experts need to be coming from the technocratic side versus being motivated by pure ideology. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much.
Вот проповедь центрального
It
банкира.
is a sermon of a central banker. It is one of a kind. Let me sum up a little bit. I believe we have had a very interesting discussion that has overstepped the boundaries of economics. And an economic scientist has taken the place of a high priest and has spoken about the post-crisis world as well as the post-truth world we have found ourselves in. We have talked about the major risks and problems we are faced with. I believe this discussion is gonna continue. Mostly we have talked not about the economic, but super-economics or post-economics. And we have talked about the risks related to globalization, to the development of human capital, to populism, digitalization. We have also had a look at whether digitalization is a risk or an opportunity. Well, it is both, of course. And I couldn't understand whether it was right of me to ask Jacob to speak right before you came, but I think it was the right move. It is a forum of experts, and from this point of view, being an expert is a very good thing. Expert only has the responsibility for his reputation, but not for the future of people. Because politicians and experts have different mandates. Experts know all possible answers, but they do not know the questions, whereas politicians know the questions, but they do not have the answers. They have to ask the experts to help them. And this is the goal the politicians have to pursue. And right now, at this positive note, I'd like to give the floor to you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon once again, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. My speech is also going to be about supereconomics or post-economics, so to speak. First and foremost, let me thank the organizers for the invitation. It is always interesting to participate at these discussions, to address the forum. I believe they are very useful, including for the members of the government, whom I see sitting at the first row. Today, indeed, we're talking about the problems that emerge due to the explosive technological changes that are stepping ever farther over the boundaries of the economics, and they often create very acute and unexpected problems of an ethical and moral nature. So it is no coincidence that we're talking about the values and virtues, about how the content of these concepts change. We're talking about the outlines for the future of the whole world in our countries today. Almost everything that we've been accustomed to is changing. What we've been accustomed for the past decades, if not centuries. Sometimes there is a comparison with the printing in terms of how deeply it has affected society and the life of individuals. That is a justified comparison, but of course it is not absolute. Back then, a lot of time had to pass between the development of technologies and the establishment of new social institutes. Right now it takes mere decades, if not years or even months. And the question is whether we are ready for such drastic shifts, tectonic changes, and the answer is no, we are not absolutely ready. The very nature of new technologies places the human being at the center of any economic process, because technologies create new opportunities for production in the economy. Both production and consumption become more customized. A good illustration, a case in point, is the 3D printing, when the person, him or herself, constructs the goods they need. So they are both a producer and a customer. There is a new term, prosumer. The customization has even affected the mass production, let alone education and healthcare, which primarily have to be tied to a concrete person. Right now we understand that the education of future is going to be a system that is going to be based on a personalized education trajectory with open education resources and new attitude, a new approach to the outcome of education, and new things will have to be taught, and we have to set the task of changing our attitude to healthcare and education, to improving one's qualification, to raising the income of those who work in these fields, because doctors and teachers are the key groups that set the future course of each and every country. Secondly, the new technological structure raises the value, the preciousness of intellectual capital. The human capital is about creativity, about knowledge, as well as the quality of governance. These factors are becoming increasingly important in terms of global competition. Amid these conditions, human being becomes the utmost, the absolute value. When managerial decisions are made in Russia, we do that when developing any development programs. As is known, the end of the last century was the high-tech period, the high technologies in agriculture and industry, whereas right now it is combined with the high epoch, so to speak, the era of high humanitarian technologies that seeks to develop to the maximum and to use efficiently individual and collective capacities of people. And that means that apart from the traditional terms of references and business plans, which analyze technological economic parameters, it is going to be of increasing importance to analyze the social and moral consequences, the humanitarian expertise, if you'd like, and it is a very important challenge to those who make these decisions and put them into practice.
Well, intelligence is a special resource. The fact that it is becoming one of the leading drivers in today's economy alters considerably the market landscape. There can be not too much of the intelligence. It generates new spheres of activity and new opportunities to develop, and the surfeit of intellectual resources would not entail a slump in its price, unlike what happens with other resources. New competitive sectors open up, and one couldn't fancy those in the past. For example, now speak about the competition of private digital currencies or cyber currencies. Theorists predicted that in the middle of the past century. It's a new challenge for the governments and business community and experts. Also, we see different approaches to cryptocurrencies, from prohibitive to absolutely liberal ones, and everybody today is concerned where the limit in the cryptocurrency race lies. Is it a dead end of the cyber revolution? One cannot rule out completely that we will not find ourselves once again in a scenario which was the case in 1990s, with the emergence of multiple companies building upon the advent of the internet, and in early 2000s these mostly disappeared. But the technology, I'm referring to internet, is preserved and is today playing an ever-growing role in our lives. Similarly, in several years, cryptocurrencies may disappear, but the underlying technology, which is blockchain, will become part of our everyday routines. I cannot rule out this as well. And for the traditional spheres, we see an active role of the new stakeholder, which is the artificial intelligence. Some of the experts say that it keeps expanding and that there may be a rebellion of artificial intelligence in the future, but to a large extent it's not an economic but a moral and ethical challenge. Like take the unparalleled transparency of our private lives that we see today because of the digital transformation. Technologically, there is no full privacy at this point of time. For the economy, it may not be bad because one may attain ideal and perfect advertising targeting, predict and shape demand for new products and services, provide digital trade and improve its efficiency. But the point is whether the information will be protected from abusers, and whose interests matter most, those of society, of government, companies or individuals. And there is the reverse of that. One may not only target advertising but impose or tout products, and sometimes we see that in the political sphere as well. And we can see obtrusive propositions of political, not only commercial products. Sometimes the privacy and the private space notions may disappear, it seems. But by and large, the traditional values system is based upon the notion of privacy. Will it not entail a reassessment? But I hope that the fundamental values will remain as they are, because they are basic and fundamental, and they've been with us despite the radical changes of the past time. It is, anyway, a mental challenge, a formidable one. And our economic life changes as well. Using the common indicators, we may not always infer what has been happening in our economy. Such key indicators, like the GDP growth rate, still matter, but for the clarity of the picture, for the fullness of the picture, we should have another indicators. For example, the uneven distribution of public goods, or the rate of satisfaction of all the people with their lives, and with the environment and their prospects in life and services that they see. And it's obvious that the modern technology transforms the labor market. It's only the start of the radical changes. What has happened with the main trend, we may ask? The growth in unemployment is considered to be the direct effect of the automation and robotics, and the so-called disruptive technologies have already become a reality, but it's not the only possible effect and outcome, and we should bear that in mind, because the new technology may help us cope with the deficit of manpower, which is relevant for many a country, including this one, because of the low birth rates in the 1990s. In near future, will definitely be among these countries and have similar problems, and automation robotics may lend us a helping hand and enhance the labor market, not instigate unemployment. On the contrary, it will give grounds for greater labor efficiency and justified rise in wages. If we look from a broader perspective, we will see that the technology progress brings about the reduction of the working time. And Karl Marx said back then that the level of development of our society and our state is prescribed by the amount of free time, not the working time. And the qualifications will become more stringent and the work will become more creative and interesting. Probably we'll see a transformation of our ideas about the intellectual property rights and the civil legislation and tax legislation will undergo changes, and new and other sectors of the law will be involved and impacted, like the criminal and procedural law. We may see the growth of inequality. It's not about only the income inequality, but uneven territorial development. The pace of technology change in big cities may give them additional benefits before small towns and rural area, and we are to provide for normal conditions for all the people, no matter where their whereabouts are. And I would add another risk of a technology curtain, a barrier between the developed countries that have the new technology at hand and have the opportunity to streamline and advance these technologies, and there are other countries that don't have these opportunities. There are technology risks that are related to the rapidly growing sophistication of information systems. A glitch may become a major failure. Cybercrime is becoming a reality, and some hostile action, unlike Air Force or submarine navy or the nuclear deterrent, cyber weapons don't require a large-scale industrial base, so terrorists may make use of it, which is another risk that is being multiplied. So today, it's obvious all the countries need to do much more to provide more security in the cyberspace and should coordinate closer. It's not only about the deployment of information technology as we thought around a decade ago. It's about a root and branch review of our daily routines and life and the way our governments and states function. In Russia, which has been said today, we focus on the digital economy program and will do our best to transform some of the sectors of our economy, as well as specific businesses and companies. Dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, these have been only some of the trends that we should pay attention to, that merit our attention. A lot in the human history was done and perpetrated thanks to the outside-of-the-box ideas and novel concepts. They guided us to the new targets of technology development, and they helped change the system of public values. Today, these developments are at a much more rapid pace, and the rules of the new world are now only fledgling. And in this country, we are aware that we should not be reactive, we should be proactive, creating the new context. We shouldn't wait for the world to change, we should change the world ourselves. I wish everybody success and interesting debates and new concepts and novel ideas. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Prime Minister,
огромное спасибо, но по сути я должен сказать, что вы задали повестку дискуссии на форуме следующих 2,5 дней. Я прямо
provided us the guidelines for the debates in the upcoming 2.5 days, covering all the main items on the agenda. This is what we wanted and are going to discuss. Now we adjourn, colleagues.